Hey folks, Chuck Black here. We're doing 52 weeks of Python and we are in week 33. And the topic for this week is going to be Netconf. That is, how do we communicate with devices using Netconf from a Python application. So what we will be talking about in this lesson is we'll be talking a little bit about how Quokka uses Netconf, which is kind of representative of how network management and automation tools use Netconf. That is for communicating with devices. We'll talk about how Netconf is the protocol and that the data is actually formatted in XML format. So we'll remind ourselves of how we deal with XML and what XML actually looks like. We'll be going through some examples and talking about libraries that we use, such as ncclient, which does the Netconf for us, and then how do we deal with XML data. We'll look at this eTree thing from LXML. We'll also look at XML to dict, which I favor because I'd prefer to deal with data in Python data structures rather than having to parse an XML tree, but maybe that's just me. And we'll also be looking at this xml.dom.minidom just for the purposes of parsing the string and allowing us to do a little bit of interesting stuff with it. So we will be talking to our CSR device in the sandbox and the NXOS device in the sandbox. The common code just connects to those devices, unfortunately, because XML seems to behave differently for those, Netconf behaves differently for those devices, primarily because the definition of the models that are supported, etc., is different between devices. Then we're only doing a little bit to the Nexus device, and then we have a lot of stuff that communicates with the CSR device, and we show how you can get the entire configuration, also how you can get a specific portion of the data from the device. We talk about the difference a little bit between configuration data versus operational data, which is possible in a Netconf world, and operational data meaning status or state data, and config data being the things that get set in order to set the configuration for the device. That's kind of important to know, and sometimes you need to do a get instead of get config. So we talk all about that stuff. We take a peek at how Quokka has a device that does Netconf in a raw manner. So I'm not using Napalm. I'm using ncclient to talk to the device, and we'll see that we do not yet have CPU and memory percentages available. I do have information on how to get that data, but I haven't updated Quokka to do that yet. That's what we'll be talking about, so hang on to your hats and we'll get started talking about Netconf. Okay, so let's get started talking about Netconf and about how you can exercise the Netconf protocol from within Python, the library that we use for that. Now, why are we interested in Netconf? Well, as you can see here, sometimes Quokka will make use of Netconf in order to communicate with networking devices. And so what you need to know about this is that Netconf is the protocol and XML is the way that the data is formatted. Now, XML should sound familiar to you. We've done a session on XML and translating data from XML format into Python data structures and vice versa. We use the XML to dict library. Now, there are many other libraries that allow you to parse XML data. Just going back to here, you can see that it's pretty hierarchical, and you might want to go through and parse it in some organized manner. There are tools that will help you to do that. In addition to this tool, XML to dict, that helps you to put it into Python, and then you can just use Python directly. For me, myself, I've never used XML in the raw and needed to do it, but it seems to me, on the surface anyway, that I would be more comfortable, since I am a software developer, not worrying about so many XML tools and all the details, and rather I would get it into a format that I could use in Python and then just use Python mechanism, which I'm very familiar with, to do whatever it is that I needed to do. Now, you may be in a situation where that's not an option. There may be limitations to this XML to dict that I didn't run into. I did run into some situations where I actually had to create my own inventory because it required the root to be a dictionary, and actually for me I had to have the second item be a dictionary as well. So there may be flaws or defects or limitations, or maybe it's just the way I used it, but there may be reasons why you can't use this, and then using some of the tools for parsing may be something more along your lines. But that said, the reason that we're looking at this is just for the purposes of handling this types of data. If you are using Napalm, as we've discussed, this gets handled for you, but if you have to do it manually, kind of in a raw manner, then using a library or a package like ncclient, which is what we use, may be of use to you. And that's what we're going to look at in this next examination of Netconf code. So here's the code in which we do Netconf stuff. It's called Netconf example within the project. It's in M04 networking like the other examples. And let's get an overview of the code. Now, as you can see, there's like 120 lines of code or something. So there's a fair amount going on. Some of it may seem to be a little bit repetitive, but we're doing different things, but in the same manner or pattern. But before we dive into that, let's have background on what exactly we are using to do stuff that we're doing. Now, the thing I've highlighted here, ncclient, this is the package that we are using to do Netconf stuff to devices. So I can tell you that the documentation is a little bit sparse for ncclient, but as of the time that I wrote this, it was one of the more popular libraries for doing it, and I had done it in other classes before that I've taught, like for Juniper, and I think for Cisco maybe did a little bit of ncclient stuff when we weren't doing SDN stuff. But ncclient is what we are using in this particular example. So this is for communication with the device. Now, as I mentioned, the protocol that we use is going to be Netconf, and the format of the data is going to be XML. And so the things that you see here, this LXML, this is an XML parsing library that allows you to, as you can kind of get impression of here, eTree, it allows you to go through the elements that are in a tree and find specific tags, etc. We've looked at XML to dict before, so I'm going to use that. That's to get things out of XML into Python data structure format. And then down here, simply because it wanted to be separate and it has this no inspection stuff, etc., for working around a PyCharm bug. I don't even know that I'm using that at this point in time, or maybe I just didn't run into the bug. But there is this package called minidom. So it's xml.dom.minidom, and I'm going to be using something called parse string. And so as we go through here, you will see reference to each of these things. I kind of bounce a little bit back and forth. Obviously, I'm going to be doing the ncclient stuff. That will be fairly clear, but I will be using these other mechanisms for doing stuff as we go through the code. So let's look a little bit at what it does. So let's look at what I'm actually doing. I'm going to define two different device structures. I have a CSR device structure, a dictionary here, and then I have an NXOS one. And this is purely for me to do things like, well, mainly to connect to the device. So it gives the host name, it has the port, the username and password, and then this particular name is important for when I do ncclient type stuff. So I have these two devices, and what I'm going to do in my code is I'm going to loop through my two devices. Now, if you have an eagle eye and you remember from the previous stuff that I recorded that was more of an overview just a moment ago, if you're listening to this consecutively, then I had another statement here that I was actually only iterating through, I believe, the CSR device. But I actually uncommented that and set up this one so that I'm going through the two devices. What you will notice, though, is this. When we get down here, I'm actually doing one or the other when I get to actually doing Netconf ncclient and XML type stuff. I found that there were enough differences. The only common code really is this connection. So I do at least get this connection. And so what you'll see over here is I'm connected to the NXOS device, and then I get a little bit of information from it, and then I go the next time iteration around. That's all I do for the NXOS. Then the second time around, I'm connecting to this CSR device, and I'm doing the bulk of that stuff. And if I was to just scroll down here, you'll see there's a whole lot of stuff that I do with the CSR device because there's better examples. And I found my experience is that a lot of the examples that I found for communicating with these devices end up being old when they change the Yang model definition for things on the Cisco devices. So this was something I found that worked, and yeah, so that's just how I did it. I figured it was better to get this lesson out there so you know how to use these libraries, and then you can experiment with talking to your own devices however you choose. But what are we doing? We're looping through the two different devices, and then for every device, we're going to go through this connection. Now let's look at this code here. I kind of glossed over this and said, oh yeah, the connection is common, but I didn't mention what I'm doing here. What is manager? Well, manager is actually imported from ncclient. So this is where I'm setting up my connection to the actual device using Netconf and using this ncclient library. And the result that I get from doing this, I'm passing in a bunch of parameters, as you can see. For those of you that are newer to Python, make note these are passing parameters by keyword. I have the keyword host, I have port, I have username, I have password, I have device params, and I have host key verify false. That's important. Otherwise, there will be security issues and you won't be able to connect. So I'm referencing my device that I've created. Here's my device. So it will either be the NXOS device or the CSR device. So when I say device with a key of host, it will be either this key if I'm doing the CSR device, or it will be this key right here if I'm doing the NXOS device. The same is true for port, username, password, and device params. I'm passing it in to the ncclient code because it wants to know, am I talking to a CSR device? Am I talking to a Nexus device? You can look at the documentation, sort of paltry though it is, and find out what this value needs to be for your type of device. I saw that they support Juniper, a bunch of Cisco models, HP models, and some others. So maybe Arista, I can't remember. So you'll need to take a look at that in the documentation. Let me just do a quick peek here. I don't have it up, but if you were to Google ncclient documentation, then it will take you to the ncclient readthedocs.io page where you can get some information about ncclient. So this is where you can find this information. All right. Okay, as we get into the code, there's something that you need to understand. There are generally two different ways of getting data from a device. One way is to do a get. So this is my ncclient connection, my Netconf connection, however you want to express that. One is to do a get, and when you do a get, you will typically be getting a piece of the tree of XML data, and you will be passing in a particular XML thing that expresses exactly what that data is going to be. We'll look at that in a minute. The other way, instead of doing a get, you do a get config, and in this situation here, I'm getting the running config, and after that, what you can do is you can get specific elements from that particular data that you got back. So here I do a get config. It's called config. I actually parse it into something called XML doc, and then I get a piece of it. So just in general, remember this and commit it to your mind so that you understand it. One way to get the data is to a get, and that's where you specify the part of the subtree, the data that you want. The other way to do it is to get the entire configuration, and then from that point to use the data that you got back as an XML document, that configuration, and to parse it. Now, the second important piece of information that I want you to understand as we go through this is that in the Netconf world, there are two types of data. One type of data is configuration data. That's the data that you set on the device that effectively causes the device to be configured in a particular way. The second type of data is referred to as operational or state data. And operational or state data in general is the data that the device itself generates or measures, and it is data that you can get. An example of configuration data would be like the OSPF configuration or configuration of security credentials on the device. An example of operational data would be interface counters or the status of a particular, the operational status, say, of an interface. So a Netconf, unlike other protocols like SNMP, it actually goes to great lengths to separate those two types of data. If you want more information about that, you can read about it. I did a quick Google of Netconf config versus operational data. And don't worry about the client business here. It's not really a web-based thing, but there's a get operation on operational data. Netconf separates configuration and state or operational data. So that is important because when you do a get config, what are you getting? You're getting the configuration of the device. You're not getting status, operational, real-time type data, but you're getting configuration data. So you can examine the configuration, and the stuff that it gets sent back to you may be important, and it may be something that you can get. Like in this example here, I'm getting the serial number. In another case down below, we're going to get the version in multiple manners, one using get and another by parsing this document. So just to review, there's two ways to get data in general at a high level. One is using get, and that's where you need to specify the subtree, which can be difficult to find this information, I will tell you, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And the second way is to get the entire configuration if you want to look at configuration information. And that's one of the two types of things, and the other is the type of data that is on the device can be either configuration data or operational data. And if you're going to get data that is operational and is not part of the configuration, then you'll need to use this get, and you'll need to understand all of this stuff. And just so you know, don't hold your breath. We're not going to go into details of all of this. I found all of the data about this stuff. In fact, you'll see that I have some examples down here. They call them filters, specifying the namespace and the particular data that you happen to be interested in. Here, a reader and follower of this class has given me nice, helpful information about how to get CPU usage, which is clearly operational or state data, and memory statistics data. So we will take a look at that when we get to it. But in those situations, of course, I'm going to need to be doing a get in order to get that piece of operational data. Okay, let's begin to look at the code in more detail. All right, so as you can see, I have a for loop here, but I just have this if and then elif, and that's everything is going to fall into one or the other of those categories. And so for my Nexus device, I'm only doing one request. And if we look over here, you can see there's my connection to my Nexus device, and then I'm done. And after that, I'm connecting to my CSR device. So I only do one thing, but let's look at what I do in this situation. So for my Nexus device, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a string, which is an XML formatted data. And this magic XML data right here is telling the device, hey, what I want to get is the serial tag. All the information that is part of this serial tag, I want you to give that to me. So it's going to, I'm requesting basically the outer layer is going to be the system, and then the inner piece that I want to get out of it is going to be this serial item. And so what I do then, before we look over here at the data, let's look at how we get that. What I do is I use my NC connection. Remember, that's what we got when we did manager.connect. I'm going to use my NC connection, and I'm going to do a get. Remember, this is where we get something specific out of the device, and we can specify the first item here, the subtree, and there are different alternatives that you can give in this in order to get certain pieces of the data that are part of this XML tree on the device. And then we're passing in this serial number XML and XOS. That's this thing right here. And when we do that, it's going to come back and we are going to get the data. The data is going to be part of this response that we get back. So we're going to say, we're going to use this eTree library, and I'm saying, I want you to convert this data element part of the response and give me a pretty print version of that so that it's a nice string. And I want you to actually decode that. And this is just the way, this is kind of the pattern that I found online for dealing with eTree data that I get back from this toString, needing to do a decode and then converting it or coercing it into a string. And that causes this right here to get printed out. So this is the end result of what I get back. It's not actually as pretty as it might be. I may have something goofed up with that, but down in the innards of it, you can see, oh, look, there's the serial number. So I did actually extract the serial number from that data. Now, I would probably be inclined to use this XML to dictionary on that string, on that XML data, and try to convert it and deal with it in a Python way rather than dealing with it via XML. But there you can see the output of that request. That's the one thing that we do for the Nexus device. Let's take a look at what we do with the CSR device. And I'm going to go a little bit faster through this so that you get a general idea. Now, the first thing that we do is we get the entire configuration. So here, as this comment says, we're going to get the whole config, and then we're going to parse it. So we're not getting a single piece of configuration or operational data using get, but we are instead getting the entire running config. And if you look over here, I said I wasn't going to do that. If you look over here, here's my get config output. So you wonder what the entire configuration of your Cisco device looks like in XML format rather than in the nice, more human readable format that you get it when it's printed out when you do a show run or whatever. This is what the XML version looks like. Now, while this may not be easily readable by humans, the advantage is, and this is important, compared to CLI output, it's very computer readable. So it's there's no, you don't have to worry about spaces or extra special characters or doing regular expressions or any of that stuff. It's all right here for you in wonderful XML format. And you may say, well, XML is kind of big and clunky. And I would say, well, then you can just convert it into Python data and deal with it there. But you don't have to do the ugly screen scraping, having to be at the whim of somebody changing the output of a table, adding a space or adding a dash or adding a character or something like that. So that's why XML is good. As a human trying to read it, it can be a little bit cumbersome. But that is what we're doing down here. We're getting the configuration. So here we've gotten the configuration and I'm printing it out using this same pattern. As I'm going through here, I'm wondering myself, did I really need to do all of this? So I wrote this maybe 3 months ago. Hey, let's do this, annotate. I think I talked about that last time. Let's see. This is looking like, so I started to write stuff back in July to do this Netconf stuff. I did some stuff here in January. That's the stuff when I found out about this really nice filter. This data right here, which I did not have. A friend from the communicating with me via the YouTube comments gave me this information. So I did write this a very long time ago when I was first doing Netconf stuff. So I may revisit this and just try to figure out, okay, did I really need to do this entire thing? It seems like I'm doing it multiple times, but maybe this is what has to be done. Anyway, this is what I'm doing to print it out. I do the git config, and you can see over here, I print the whole thing out. Now I'm going to keep scrolling down here because at some point in time, my finger's getting tired, so I'm going to do it this way. At some point in time, I'm going to get to the end of this. Here. You know what? I could have done this an easier way, and this is what I'm going to do because I want to show you. In here, I'm going to do Control F, and I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 space. Now I can go through all of my little, because I was consistent in printing stuff out, I'm able to just find the important stuff, the kind of the paragraph headings of what I did. Here's my git config, and you can see where the scroll bar is there. And this is where I began to do the other interesting stuff. So let's look at what I did here. I get this XML doc. So how did I get that? I took the config that was returned up here. So this is the actual object that I got back from, actually I don't know if it's a string. No, it's an object. So it's an object that I got back, and I do parse string, and this is going to give me this thing called XML doc. From XML doc, I can call a number of functions, and let's just remind ourselves that these functions are what I'm using. I did parse string, and so I'm able to do something with the data now that I have done this parse string function, and that gives me XML doc. Now that I have XML doc, I can call methods associated with it. So get element by tag name version, and then I'm going to print out version and whatever. So here you see I'm actually printing out the version that I got back from this particular device. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to print out the host name. And here you see I'm printing out the host name for the device. So I'm extracting these things one at a time. Contact email address. Unable to retrieve the email address. All right, I tried, but I couldn't find it. What about username? Yeah, it found the username is Cisco. And let's see. Oh, I found 3 different usernames. So I went through for all of these usernames, and I'm printing every one out. So there's a user called Cisco, a user called developer, and a user called root. And that is this particular section of code, which goes from here. This is where I'm parsing the document using git. After I've done the parse string, I can then do get elements by tag name, and that is the output of me doing that. And what I'm showing you right here is, you know what? Look at this version right here. It's 16.9. That's what I got the element by tag name. If I was instead to say, I want to get the specific version, how do I do that? Well, guess what? I found out a magic string that I can use. Let me get rid of this so that these are easier to read and not squishing everything. So here you see, let's see, where did it go? My version filter right here. This data is what I'm going to be sending in to my GET request. I'm back here at ncclient. I do GET. This is going to create a Netconf GET request. I'm getting a piece of the tree, so a subtree, and I'm wanting to get the version. So I'm asking to get the version back, and then I end up printing out what I got back. So I get back this thing called response, and I'm printing that out. What does it look like? It looks like this thing right here. So this is my GET version. Now you and I can look at this and we can say, hey, how about that? Version is 16.9. That's the same thing as I got right there. So I'm getting the same data in two different ways. And the last thing that I want to tell you before I go on to the next thing is this. Remember, because this data is actually returned to us when I show the running config, I'm able to get this data from the actual configuration. This is when I did a get config. When I do a get, I got the same thing. If there was operational data that was not part of the running config, then I would need to definitely know how to specify the appropriate filter so that I could get that data using the get request, the get function. Now the last bits of code in this example file that I added relatively recently, and they are to get CPU filter information. So here I'm doing a get for CPU filter, and to get memory filter information. It's really getting memory information using a memory filter, getting CPU information using a CPU filter, and doing stuff with that. And so you may say, why am I interested in CPU and memory? Well, if you recall, with Quokka, we do a pretty decent job of getting CPU and memory utilization from devices because I use Napalm when I do SSH to them, and Napalm gathers that information for me. I have a raw Netconf access that I do to this CSR device that we're looking at, and you'll notice, and you will have noticed if you use Quokka, that I don't have CPU or memory information, and I mentioned that at various times, and a super helpful gentleman named Eric T. I got in a conversation with him, and he gave me the actual filter that was required in order to get both CPU usage as well as memory statistics usage. And so that is what I have done in here. I've created a get of the CPU information and then a get of this memory information. And if I was to go down further here, then you'll see here I am doing a get of this CPU subtree information. Now you'll see where this scroll bar is, and I'm going to hit show me the next one of these dash 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 space, and you'll see the scroll bar, it went all the way down to the bottom. So basically all of this information here is all CPU stuff. It's basically the CPU process table, and so that is of less interest to me. Here's the memory subtree, which is way easier for me to understand. Total memory, used memory for the processor, and then for the LSMP IO. I'm not familiar with the internal design of these devices, but I'm assuming that these are two different memory blocks that are associated with the main processor and then the IO processor or something of that nature. So I could clearly come back here to my Quokka and implement that, at least for memory, but I haven't done that yet, as you'll see when we take a peek at the Quokka implementation. But it's there to be done. What does the code look like? It looks exactly like the other stuff. I'm doing nothing different, just doing get of a different, using a different filter. This is the CPU. That gave me all of that data. And then the memory, I did the same thing. Now, the last thing that is probably going to be of interest to you after I get this data for the memory is that I then used my sneaky package XML to dictionary. And so if you're tired of looking at all of this, what in my mind I'm going to call it ugly, but I may have XML lovers that I've just offended, but for me it's just easier to think of things with what I'm familiar with. And so when we take this memory, I don't really know how to parse this, but you know what? I can look at this and I can figure out how to parse this. This is the Python data version of this. So all I would need to do is go down into memory statistics and go into memory statistic, and then this is a list, and there's going to be two things. If I'm only interested in the memory associated with the processor, then I can come and I can say what's my total memory and my used memory, and I can come up with a memory statistic from there. That wouldn't be too hard. If I'm interested in the other type of memory, which would be LS and SNMPIO, then I can look at that particular one and get the data for that one. Anyway, that's basically this last part of the code here is where I'm changing it into nice handy Python data structures, and then I'm just doing a pretty print and it comes out looking like this. And for me, that makes it a lot easier to deal with. So that is this code that I've written and shown you. Just to review, we did get config, and we parsed. When we did a get config, we showed some ways that we can parse it, and lastly, we actually used XML to dict to print it out into a nice Python data structures. Okay, so let's look at how this might be used in a real-world environment. My real-world environment is Quokka, and you can see here that I am in device info, which is within the device package, which is within the controller package. Probably gives you a good indication that this is where things happen in terms of talking to devices, and that's true. Every time I pull a device or when the user has a screen up for a particular device and asks to look at the configuration or ARP table or fax or whatever, we end up in here. And so here is get device info, and I make a decision to call one of these things, one of these functions, based on the type of transport that we have defined for the device. So if the transport that we're using for device communication is napalm, which it is in most cases, I can do this. I do have one device set up that I'm communicating to, the same one that we were doing in the Netconf example, and I'm going to use ncclient in a raw manner. So I'm not going through the abstraction of napalm, but I'm trying to do things myself just for the purposes of demonstrating it within here, really no other. And so the function that I call is get device info ncclient, and if I go down to where that actually is, it's in the same file. So you can see once I've gone into get device info ncclient that what I'm going to do, once I determine that I need to get live information, I will return facts if I have them, if we're not requesting live information. So once we come into get device info ncclient, then if we decide that we need to connect to the device and get live information, then we're going to do this manager.connect exactly like we did in the Netconf example. So if we go up here, we can see that sure enough, I have imported manager from ncclient. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to pass in the actual device host name, the Netconf port, the username and password, and the ncclient name that has been stored for this device type. And I'm going to do a connection. Once I have a connection, I'm actually going to go and get the entire configuration. All right, and this is just the way I implemented it way back a long time ago. Let me see how long ago this was. So I initially did this way back in July. I added some more stuff, change in October here. So if the user has asked for the configuration, then I'm going to just return the configuration. If they're asking for facts, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start populating this facts dictionary, but you see most of the things are actually unset at this point in time. And I'm going to take this config and I'm going to parse it, and I'm going to try to get as much information as I can from there. So I'm going to get the version and the host name from there, and if I've found them, then I'm going to set facts sub OS version equal to the version, and the facts sub host name, the key host name, equal to that host name, and actually set the same value for the FQDN. So once I've done that, the serial number I don't believe is part of the actual configuration. So for this, I need to do a get. Remember, we're doing the difference between doing a get config like we're doing up here, and here I'm specifically attempting to get the serial number. Now, I don't actually use the serial number for anything in terms of what I'm printing out, but this is something that I'm interested in doing, and so I have some code here that actually goes and gets the serial number, and then I don't do anything with it. So this is some partially implemented code. What you will probably see in the not so distant future is me doing a get based on this memory filter and then doing some calculations so that I'm then able to set, let's see, I don't even have it here. This is for part of the facts. I would want to be setting information about the memory and CPU utilization in that situation. So yeah, that's kind of what I will be doing and adding in the future. But for right now, as you can see, I get the configuration and I return it if that's all that was requested. But if we're interested in facts, which is what we are interested in when we are actually printing this information out, then that is where I get that from. Okay, so that is the usage of ncclient in Quokka. As I mentioned, I probably would not use this in any real production sense because I have other means of talking to that device that are perfectly acceptable and give me as good or better data, but I wanted to demonstrate how it could be done, and as you can see, it is still a work in progress, but it's something. So there you go, a little bit of Netconf ncclient stuff within Quokka. Okay, let's review what we talked about. We were talking about Netconf today, and we talked about how Netconf is the protocol and that the data is formatted in an XML format, and we have to deal with all of that. We looked at the code that actually does this, and we mentioned that we're using ncclient as our Netconf package by which we communicate with devices. We talked about how we're using this etree thing. We're also using XML predict at certain points, and we're talking about XML DOM, mini DOM for parsing the string. We talked about how we'll be getting the data, we'll be using the protocol to communicate with the devices that returns us the data using ncclient, and then we'll be parsing the data using etree, LXML stuff, as well as XML predict, and parsing the string. We talked about how we're communicating with two different devices, and we show that connecting is common, but when we go and talk to the device, we only have a little bit that we do with the Nexus device, and the bulk of what we do is with the CSR device, as you can see from here. We talked about how we'll be doing either a get in order to get a specific item. In this case, it's a subtree portion where we have a filter that has this type of XML that defines what exactly we're getting. In this situation, we're getting the serial number information. Or you can do get config where you get the entire configuration. And along these lines, we talked about how there's differences in the data that you will be getting back, in that there with Netconf is both configuration data and operational data. And if you do get config, then you can get everything that comes back from like a show run command, but you won't get operational data like counters, things of that nature. So you'll need to be doing that. We did look at different ways to get the data. Here we do a get config, we end up with the config, and then we parse it. And then we use this XML doc object that we get back from parseString with minidom to get elements by tag name. Here we get the version and the host name and the username and things of that nature. We talked a little bit about the filters that we'll pass in when we do a get. So here I'm getting the version, and you will be able to see, you can see that the version number that we get back is the same one as we get back when we get the whole config, and then we actually extract it. And then lastly, we talked about the CPU as well as memory, getting that data, how I was helped by somebody who told me what these values should be. I will warn you, they're difficult to find online, so you kind of need to know where to look. And so we examined doing that. And the last thing that I'll point out is we did use XML to parse it, and at the very bottom of this you can see data in our friendly Python format that, I don't know about you, but I feel much more comfortable looking at data like this than I do having to parse data that looks like this. So that is what we looked at in that regard. We did look a little bit at how we do things inside Quokka, and here we Quokka when we're polling devices. If I have set it up to be an ncclient device, which I did just for teaching purposes, we go and we do the same thing that we did before, where we connect to the device. And then in this situation, I'm doing both a get config and then extracting information using get elements by tag name. And then later on down here, I'm actually doing a get to get the serial number, but in actuality, you can see that I parse it, but because that's grayed out, I don't actually do anything with it. So this is a work in progress. I will probably be pulling at least memory statistics data over into here so I can do in Quokka, when we look at Quokka and we see what data it's displaying. I have CPU data, I just don't know how to calculate the CPU utilization from that data. There's probably a way to do it, but the memory seems fairly straightforward. This memory usage, I can easily do total and used memory and figure out how to do that. So that is Netconf, and it has XML as the data definition language inside of it, but I'm using ncclient, and hopefully you know a little bit more about it now than you did before. Thanks for listening.